welcome to the Upshot, Ultiworld's podcast about the latest in the disc golf world. I'm the host today, Josh Mansfield. Charlie is out on paternity leave still, home with his baby. Everything's going well. But in the meantime, we have a special guest. Jesse Weisz is a writer and contributor to Ultiworld, as well as the executive director of GEO, an organization that helps teachers travel around the world. And we've got Jesse with us today to talk a little bit about the disc golf fandom survey. So Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. I'm glad to be here.
So let's start. I would love to hear a little bit more about your background, because this survey is one that it's really a deep dive into fans' attitudes around disc golf. So what's your background? Is there some background in statistics, in data collection, and what got you interested in this project in the first place?
Nothing. No background. I'm terrible at math. Never took a statistics course. So this was just something I was interested in. In terms of like the history of this project was, I was curious about why I was rooting for certain players over other players. Were there some biographical details in my life that made me choose player A over player B? And I also was rating players on my own, just kind of creating a 0 through 10 score, just as an exercise. And I was wondering if that would change over time as well. And then I thought, why not do a poll? And then that kind of got out of control, and it became this really big survey. And what I thought was going to be a fun little project turned into hours and hours and hours and hours of work. But I'm really happy with what it's become and what it can become in the future as a longitudinal study of disc golf.
Well, it really has become a comprehensive poll with what you had something like 2,200 folks responding this year. No, it was more than that. It was almost 2,700.
3,040.
Oh man. Okay. I was even underestimating it. So 3,000 people responded to the survey this year. And what year in the survey are we, Jesse?
This is the second year. So the first year we had 1,500-ish people. And then this year we have, well over 3,000. And that might not seem like a large number, but keep in mind, this survey takes like around 20 minutes to take. So getting over 3,000 people in this niche community of disc golf to take a 20-minute survey with about 119 questions, I'm pretty happy with that. And hopefully next year, through some new media outlets, we'll be able to even get it further out there and get a larger sample size.
Well, and I did a little bit of statistics for like political research methods when I was in college. And the thing they always said to you was, if you're just doing a randomized survey, getting 1,000 people means that you have typically a fairly good sample size that can be trusted in terms of its accuracy. So for you to go to 3,000, I think it's remarkable. So this survey is published kind of in a series of articles, and we are halfway through those articles right now up on ultiworld.com.
So right now we've had 3 articles come out.
Okay. And
we've got 3 more articles that are going to come out in the next 3 weeks, I would say. So 3 that are like 80% done. And then after that, there'll probably be 1 or 2 articles just kind of cleaning up. So it'll probably end up being something like 8 articles. Last year I think it was 9 articles. So somewhere in that ballpark. We have so much data, and it's really just a matter of trying to figure out what are the gems, what are the things we want to focus on this year. But when you take 119 questions and you cross-reference them with each other, it's just there's so much so much information that we're processing. So yeah, that's the tricky part, is figuring out where to cut off.
Well, it seems then that we are not going to cover every topic in this show, so you make sure to go check out the articles. I'm going to be referencing a couple of them as we go, and the first one I wanted to start with is kind of your introductory article, and that is 2023 Fandom Survey, the survey itself, and who took it. This is a breakdown of the demographics of our survey respondents and explains a little bit about what we were looking for with the publication of this survey. So, Jesse, can you give me a brief overview of some of the highlights of that article?
I'm going to scroll down kind of as we're going. We first explain kind of the methodology of the survey. And we start off with, how did people find out about the survey? Because that's going to be very important, because there are different niches in media. And one thing we found out is I can tell you all about Ultiworld's fan base. Like, who are the people who watch Ultiworld? What are their politics? What are, all sorts of things about them. And same thing about other media sources in disc golf. So the main media organizations that sent out the survey were Ultiworld, StatMando, Reddit. We posted on Reddit and people found us through there. Foundation Disc Golf had a lot of people who filled out the survey. Nick and Matt Show promoted it. And then it was on the Players Meeting newsletter, a couple of different Facebook pages. But we're hoping to expand that media for next year so we get even more fan niches throughout the sport. So that was the first part of it. We asked the birth year of all of our respondents. So one thing we found is that a lot of millennials are following disc golf, professional disc golf, or at least found our survey. So it's kind of hard to say whether our survey covers all of disc golf fandom, but it covers the niche that is reading and willing to fill out surveys.
Well, and also then more than half the respondents, or about half the respondents, a little over 1,400 it looks like, came from either Ultiworld and the Upshot or Foundation Disc Golf. So those two sources together made up about half of your survey respondents. And like you said, very overwhelming millennial, with 1997 Gen Z being the next closest that kind of gets in that same millennial range. Just that 1 year off what would be a millennial mark. So very interesting there. Anything else in terms of demographics, education, politics that you found particularly interesting or noteworthy? All these things are covered in that first article.
Well, I think Europeans who are listening to the podcast will be interested to know what percentage they were. So about a little over 10% of our respondents were Europeans, and we compare that to the makeup of PDGA members, which is about 15% European. So we're undercounting Europeans probably. It's not like the PDGA membership doesn't necessarily perfectly align with who's into professional disc golf. But it's probably close. So there's a bit of an undercount there. But if you look at the state map that we have there, it corresponds pretty closely to what we think of as the disc golf meccas in the country. And then in terms of politics, our survey respondents skew somewhat left, but less so than last year. We have a bit more of a well-rounded political diversity of our respondents. But again, we don't know what the politics of disc golf are. I don't think anybody does. So this is, again, our respondent pool leans left.
All right. So let's jump into then the next article. Which pros do we root for and against? This is the heart of why you decided to go about the survey in the first year. And so I think this one is one that really interests me personally and a lot of people. Simon Lizotte takes the crown of the most liked player in disc golf from Kristen Tatar, who won last year by a slim margin. And again, this is for people who responded to the survey. Were you surprised to see Simon make that kind of elevation?
No, he was, right behind Kristen Tatar. And as we discussed this survey, we asked this question in two different ways about who is the most popular player in the sport. So our fandom score is people rating the players from 0 to 10, 0 being they're rooting against them as much as possible, and 10, they're rooting for them as much as possible. We didn't want this to be hate and love. It's more about rooting, which I guess makes it a little less personal, because there's certainly players that I like as people, but I root against them because for some reason I like rooting against them. And some players that maybe I wouldn't like necessarily as a person, who I root for because who knows, fandom is a little bit of a weird thing where we don't understand our psychological motivations for cheering for one player over another. But Simon actually has almost the same fandom score that he had last year. It's just Kristen Tatar's fandom score went down a little bit.
So I think the really interesting part of this, to me, of this aspect of fandom is in the score distribution. So you have a series of graphs, bar graphs, that show the number of respondents in each category. So Simon Lizotte, for example, has very few that are scored a 6 or below, and then still, again, kind of, it's almost an exponential growth from 7, 8, 9 to 10. So very much stacked towards the pro. Calvin Heimberg, same way. The other players who are well liked have a little bit more even of a distribution between the 5s to 10 mark. That's like Eagle McMahon, Paul McBeth. But what's interesting to me is that we have players like Kyle Klein, for example, who 5, 6, 7, and 8 stands out quite tall, and then is pretty low on the 0 to 4 and 9 to 10. How do you interpret the different shapes of these graphs based kind of on different players? You obviously have, other shapes, but how do you interpret some of these results?
Well, some players are more polarizing, so you're going to get a flatter distribution, and we don't really have anybody who has a U shape where you either love them or hate them. Nobody is generating that kind of distribution. But players like Paul, Ricky, Paige, they've been around a while, and so they have haters and they have people who love them, but it's much more of a flatter distribution, whereas players like Simon and Calvin, there's very few people who are rooting against them. So their distributions reflect that of being, I guess it's right now in their careers, it's hard to root against them for a lot of players. Now, if Calvin becomes number one, as he might have been this past season, I imagine there's going to be more haters who develop, because if your favorite player is always getting beaten by Calvin, then you're probably going to you're probably going to start rooting against Calvin, or a new generation of fans are going to want to root against Calvin because he's the person to beat. So I think players at different parts of their careers are going to have different distributions.
That's so interesting, because I hadn't even noticed that there isn't a U-shaped distribution. Because when I think of other sports, right, I follow a lot of different sports. I have teams that I like and I root for, and that I would probably score like my 6 and 7s. I know who my 10s are, but I also know who my 1s are. And I think most teams would be on the opposite. Like if you were to look at NFL fandom, for example, I think that most graphs would be a U shape. You have a strong, passionate group of people who want to root against them, and a very strong, passionate group of people who want to root for them. And then when you get to kind of people who are in the middle, I think it would kind of flatten and distribute a little more evenly. Why do you think it is that disc golf doesn't have people that are a U shape, that are both very, very big, like well liked and well rooted for, and then those who are also at the same time rooted against?
Well, I guess to start off with, they're people, not teams. I think it's easier to really root strongly against a team than a person. It just feels more personal to root against a person. But I would say also, if somebody's negatively perceived in this sport, it's usually going to be pretty universal. And there's very few players that have strong negative reaction that way, where there's very few positive fandom scores and lots of negative fandom scores. You get more of a flat distribution for players that are more controversial, more polarizing.
So I want to bring in one other, well, I guess, do you think that during the era where it was really just like Paul and Ricky, right? Every week it was Paul and Ricky. Do you think there was a chance that there may have been more of a U shape and like rivalries being a part to develop that? Because when I think of rivalries right now, I think of pairings, right? I think like Eagle McMahon and Calvin Heimberg are, similar aged. They're both very successful players, but they've developed differently. I don't see a lot of real rivalries in disc golf right now. Do you think that contributes to the lack of kind of that U shape that we were discussing?
It could be. I mean, we wrote a whole article about Ricky versus Paul last year, but it also feels like we're kind of, that's sunsetting right now, how important that rivalry is. So yeah, I would love to have seen what Paul and Ricky would have looked like years ago.
Yeah, need that time machine to go back and do some surveys.
Yeah.
What do you remark of the FPO charts, and what are some of the highlights of the FPO distribution versus the MPO?
Well, as I said, Paige and Katrina, they are pretty flat distributions. And Kristen Tatar looks a lot like Simon Lizotte, where it's almost no negatives and lots and lots and lots of tens. She's got 50.5% tens. So Kristen really does stand out compared to everybody else. There's a lot of women who have a majority of fives as their score. And that's because people taking the survey are less familiar with the FPO players than the MPO players overall. There's a certain percentage of the people who took this survey who probably don't follow FPO closely at all, so they have no opinion. We ask people to not give a score if they have no opinion, but I think a lot of people just give fives.
Sure, they've heard the name, they know roughly who that person is, so they're like, oh, I should answer that. I would say I think maybe 5 or 6 players are it who don't have 5 is the highest number. And some of them, like Heidi Leina, for example, is 60% 5s. Jessica Weisz, 50% 5s. I mean, some players who we know of and who we've talked a lot about on the show and we're familiar with, but who didn't do a lot in terms of the professional season this year. I was surprised by how favorable people saw Ella Hansen. And the reason I'm surprised, not because I don't think Ella is a likable player, but because Holland had, like most of the other FPO players, her top number was a 5 at almost 30%. And her next closest was an 8 at 15%. So she's got double the 5 responses, whereas Ella is more 20%. And then her 8 score is like a 17%. So Ella is a lot more flat in terms of her distribution, especially in the positive range, as opposed to Holland, who has a very large 5 score. Why do you think that is, that Ella has just increased in popularity relative to other players kind of around her that are finishing at the similar level, who are, I feel like, about similar in terms of like how well known they are as well? It's
hard to say. I guess if I had to have a theory, and I could test this out pretty easily, and we could probably look at it while we're on the show here. I have a feeling that it could have something to do with Ultiworld, that we've got a big chunk of the participants in this came through Ultiworld. And a lot of those people are also Ultimate fans. And so maybe that's part of this equation. But we have the preference gaps between the different sources. So I can see which players Ultiworld gave a preference gap to compared to other sources. And so we could test out that theory pretty quickly if I just open up a spreadsheet right here.
One of many spreadsheets, I'm sure.
Yeah. Lots of tabs within one spreadsheet. That's
got it. Yeah. Okay. The Upshot is presented by Pound Disc Golf, makers of the best bag in disc golf. Handmade in the USA, Pound bags are unmatched in quality and comfort. And backed by their lifetime guarantee, you can play better knowing Pound is at your back. If you missed out on the Carlton Farewell Tour, well, then you're in luck. Pound has reopened the custom Carlton program for a short period of time. Featuring the additional front putter pouch previously released only on Silvertip Carltons, the custom program has more features than ever before. If you needed any more reason to order, Pound is running a $50 discount for the duration of the custom Carlton program, making it easier than ever to own a bag from the best in the business. But don't wait. Color options are limited, and once they're gone, they're gone. This is your last chance to grab a Carlton from Pound Disc Golf. Head over to Pound Disc Golf today to order your custom Carlton. Pound, makers of the best bag in disc golf.
Did quickly look here, Ella versus Holland in terms of our source preference gaps. And it looks like there was an Ultiworld bump for Ella Hansen of a 0.24. So again, this is on a 0 to 10 scale. So she's getting a 0.24 bump from Ultiworld respondents, but she gets a bigger bump from Reddit respondents, 0.46. Whereas Holland's are a little bit flatter in terms of the different sources. Ella Foundation Disc Golf fans don't like Ella. They gave her a negative 0.74. So that gives you an idea of what different fan segments are giving these players. I don't really have a good answer of why Holland has lots of fives and Ella doesn't. Maybe I'll think about it overnight and see if I can come up with an answer, but I don't have a good answer for that one.
Okay. So, and that kind of comes when I go down to the change in fandom score. Ella Hansen has the highest change in fandom score for an FPO player relative. So it's her, and then Holland is the only other one that went positive this year. But Ella's she's fourth overall in terms of that change towards positive. Isaac Robinson clearly takes the cake there at 30 points. And I think the answer there is pretty obvious as to why. Winning majors, getting more publicity. The one that I was, well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised in this based on what you're talking about. Brodie Smith is the third highest jump in positive responses. I would imagine, and I don't remember, what was your foundation response like last year? Is it just from the bump in the number of foundation respondents that you think Brodie Smith increased his score so greatly from last year to this year?
Yeah, my guess with Brodie is it's clearly foundation related. Last year, foundation didn't even know about the survey, so they didn't promote it at all. And this year they promoted it, but not heavily. I think Hunter tweeted out about it and they mentioned it once on their show. So it shows just how powerful foundation is in terms of a media organization, that they didn't even make an effort and they almost eclipsed Ultiworld in respondents. So I think we were probably undercounting Brodie's popularity last year. And I don't know if we're overcounting it this year. It might be right. It might be right on now, but it was an adjustment certainly between not having foundation respondents and having foundation respondents.
Got it. Anything else in terms of who we root for that you found an interesting point of data or conversation that are kind of highlighted in this article, or data that wasn't included in the article?
Well, in change in fandom score, I think it's also important to look at some of the players that went down. Some of the most established names in the sport, if we're looking at percentage change in fandom score, Paul went down by 8.2%. Paige went down by 9.5%. Greg Barsby went down by 10.4%. Katrina Allen went down by 17.8%. Natalie Ryan went down by 31.3%. So a couple trends that I've noticed is if you're appearing less on lead cards, if you're appearing less in media, your score is probably going to go down. So when you're in people's eyes, people tend to root for you more. I also noticed that anybody who's involved with the Natalie Ryan, what was going on with Natalie Ryan's status of being able to play this year, their scores got dragged down. Katrina Allen, Sarah Hokum, they were outspoken against Natalie playing, and two of the leaders in the FPO community, and they had the biggest drops in FPO players other than Natalie Ryan, who had by far the largest drop. So kind of everybody got tarred with that event in disc golf.
Yeah, nobody won there is definitely what it looks like. Very interesting. Well, let's move on then and talk a little bit about the second article or third article, I guess.
Josh, before you move on, one of the things I was really interested in was change in fandom score after an important win. So during the survey, we had 4 pretty important wins in terms of career-changing trajectory that took place while we were taking in surveys. This survey was open for 57 days, I believe. So Isaac won Worlds, Matt Oram won MVP, Holland Hanley won Throw Pink, and Kyle Klein won USDGC. These are all the most important wins in their careers. And we saw Isaac got a bit of a bump from winning Worlds, but not as big as I would have thought. Maybe his popularity was already baked in. Matty O won MVP, and his fandom scores went up by 9.1% after that win. That's a huge increase. Holland Hanley's fandom score went down after winning Throw Pink. which wasn't surprising with the way that ended on hole 18 with the OB controversy. And then Kyle Klein's Fandom score went up marginally, 2.3%. I feel like Kyle Klein just doesn't get much of a reaction. And we can talk about that more in the next article. And then one other thing is, while we did the Fandom score, we also asked a more traditional question, which is, who is your favorite MPO player? Who is your favorite FPO player? And if we look at that data, Simon comes in at 31% of fans. That's their favorite MPO player. So that's you think about MVP. That's enormous. And again, we'll talk about that more in the next article. Calvin was in at around 20%, and Macbeth is at around 11%. So between the three of them, that's 60% of MPO fans. Their favorite player is one of those three players. And players like Eagle and Isaac Robinson both got 4.1%, which was, again, interesting. What were Isaac's numbers 2 years ago? Probably 0%. And Eagle, you would have thought maybe would have been higher, considering how important of a player he is in the sport. And Ricky Wysocki's at 2.5%. So that would be a little surprising if you looked at that a few years ago. I'm sure it was higher back then.
It really feels like wins play just an enormous role in people's popularity as a favorite player. And maybe it like Paul, it's crazy because, like you said, Ricky drops down to 2.5%. Eagle is down at 4%. You look at those players, Nate Sexton, 1.8, James Conrad, 1.8%, right? Some players who are older players who 5 years ago, if you had done the same survey, would have been at the top of the list, have all dropped. It's almost remarkable how stable Paul's number, and like the fact he's still able to accumulate 10%, despite the fact that he's not winning as regularly as Simon and Calvin and Isaac and all these other players around him.
Well, Paul went down he had the greatest drop in percentage of respondents that chose him as their favorite player. So he went down by 6.6%.
Wow.
So Macbeth, even though he's still at 11% of fans, he was at like 17% last year. And if you think about that the year before, he was probably at 20-something%. And if you think about this, say 5 years ago, maybe he was at 50% or 60%. Who knows what Paul's numbers were, because he was such a dominant force in the sport. I'll be interested to see if this rebounds this year. If, let's say Paul has an awesome year, will this rebound? Or is Paul old news to new fans? Because this is not in either of these articles that we're going to be discussing, but the fans, in terms of when they started following disc golf, as you would imagine, it's during the pandemic. So there's a lot of people who didn't really see peak Paul who are disc golf fans. And so that might be that kind of whole generation. Well, actually, we have the data on that too, of what they think of Paul compared to people who've been following disc golf longer.
Very interesting. What about over on the FPO side?
Nearly 50% of fans' favorite player is Kristen Tatar, which also explains why Holland Handley got such a backlash. If she had, if that OB call had come against, had affected a player other than Kristen Tatar, I think it would have been a lot less.
Wouldn't have changed in the same way. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then the last question, which player would you like to hang out most with? Simon, almost at a third of respondents, takes the cake. I think that's it's interesting that people's favorite player, so Simon and Calvin are up at the top, very similar to the case with with our favorite MPO player. Matty O is up there, but then Nate Sexton, Jeremy Coling, Kevin Jones, Paul Ulibarri, like those players, they actually get a bump from them being the favorite player. So let's just pick on Jeremy Coling, for example. Jeremy Coling is 0.6% of respondents' favorite player, but when you ask who you'd like to most hang out with, he jumps up to 4% and sits in 5th place. So it's interesting to me that disc golfers are picking relevant players, right? Players who are contending for wins, as their favorite players, even if they aren't the people that they would most want to be around. A very interesting dichotomy there for some of those players.
Yeah. It was Big Sexy that had the biggest bump between favorite player and who you want to hang out with. And one thing I'll mention about Simon, you can see that, Simon's who's your favorite player is around 30%, his who you want to hang out with 30%. But we looked at those two groups of people, and only 50% of people who picked Simon for their favorite player picked him as the player they most want to hang out with. So it's not the same people that are make up those 30%, which I thought was pretty interesting.
That's really interesting. Wow. All right. So let's move on then to disc golf manufacturers. You referenced it a couple of times. I'm going to turn it over here to you to pick a couple of things that you want to discuss and highlight, and then I'll ask questions as we go, because this part was very insightful to me, and there was a lot of things that I was surprised about. When I looked at like who we root for, that one, like my feelings kind of, I have a general sense of that feeling, right? Like we get emails, we get Discord respondents, I'm on Reddit regularly. So I kind of had an idea of where people's feelings are on players. I learned a lot on the manufacturer side. So Jesse, what should we know from that part?
Well, this is a new question for this year. So we don't have longitudinal data yet. We don't know what people thought last year. And I really do wish we had asked this question last year, because the number one fandom score, so again, 0 to 10, this one we used dislike and love as the two polls. Dislike at 0, love at 10. MVP took the crown with a 7.29 average fandom score. And then it follows Innova and Discraft, almost exactly the same fandom score, 6.77 and a 6.76. So these two big rivals, basically the same level of popularity, which was probably a coincidence, but also really interesting. And then Latitude 64 is a 6.58, and then Discmania is a 6.51, which again, this was fascinating. If you think about this a year ago, when Simon was still with Discmania, what would have that looked like? Would have they flip-flopped? I have a feeling that Discmania would have been number one, just on Simon power alone. And then if you look towards the bottom, we have DGA in there, which we could talk more about when we go to the distributions. But the bottom was 3.58 for Lone Star, and above that was a 4.11 for Prodigy, and above that was Dynamic Discs at 5.26. So those are the least popular large manufacturers: Lone Star, Prodigy, and then with a bit of a gap there, Dynamic Discs.
It's interesting so you look at those charts and those distributions. DGA really suffers from being nobody's favorite, but also nobody's like strong dislikes. It had at 46.3% of respondents gave DGA a 5, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about with players. Probably a lot of people who just don't feel like they had strong opinions about DGA. They've never seen a DGA disc in person. They've never thrown a DGA disc in person. DGA isn't one of the largest manufacturers, especially just kind of being under the wing of Discraft. But every other chart has some very pronounced distribution areas. Lone Star has the highest respondents in terms of those who gave them a 0. And then Prodigy's at next after that. And really, in terms of zeros, they're the only ones that break even the 10% mark at 10.5 for Prodigy and 16.6. So people have some very strong negative feelings towards Lone Star and Prodigy. And that makes sense given that, MVP more than doubles Lone Star's score.
Well, I was actually surprised when I look at the distributions for DGA. I was surprised they had so many negatives, because I thought that people would be like, yes, it's going to be a lot of 5s, that a lot of people don't know about DGA, but they do have lots of negatives. And I think that must be tied to the players that they have signed. Particularly maybe Katrina Allen she was divisive in our fandom scores. So that might be part of this. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard we don't have the data to explain that, but sure. More negatives than I would have thought. Yeah. Lone Star, very unpopular. And if we looked at our source data, in particular with Reddit, respondents who came to us through Reddit, Lone Star scored really, really poorly. And that's one thing that we found in our data, was that Reddit, people who follow disc golf through Reddit, they tend to be really well informed of controversies.
Mm, that makes a lot of sense then. I here's one question that I've got that I cannot wrap my head around. You also break down scores by generation. Millennials don't like any of the companies. MVP is the only one that got a positive score of 0.1. Every other one was negative. And then Gen Z gave every category, so that's 1997 to 2013. They like every company except MVP and Latitude 64, and they have strong dislikes for them. Like, those two are at least the negative 0.36 for Latitude 64. Gen Z's dislike of Latitude 64 is the strongest response of a negative of any generation towards any company. Why do young people hate Latitude 64?
Well, I'll say that they don't hate Latitude 64. These are preference gaps. So if you take you take that negative 0.36 and you subtract it from their overall, the preference gaps are, we take the average fandom score that our whole pool of 3,040 people gave them, and then we take the specific segment, Gen Z in this case, and we take what their average was, and then we subtract it from that, or actually we add it to that. Then we get a negative 0.36 preference gap. So they're giving Latitude, if you think about it, just over a 6. So I guess the question is, why do Gen Z people like Latitude 64 less than other fans? That would be the way I'd frame it. And I don't know. I have no idea.
I mean, it's so bizarre to me.
The MVP one was the weirdest one for me because MVP has this. It doesn't make sense why millennials like MVP more than any other generation, and then why Gen Z are in the red for MVP. I have no idea.
It's so bizarre. The other one I thought was interesting, the silent or boomer generation, 1928 to 1964, likes Lone Star at a rate of 1.14 points higher than the average fandom score. Is that so that puts them right around almost a 5, right? That's the boomer generation averages a 5 for Lone Star as opposed to the 3.5 score. Is that more just not knowing about Lone Star, not being on Reddit, or is it the marketing? Do we have any questions that would help answer that?
Well, I mean, I would like to clarify. They don't like them more. They dislike them less. They still dislike them. Okay. They're still below a 5. So even with their biggest preference gap, boomers still don't like Lone Star.
Okay.
So they're still below 5. So why do they not dislike them as much as other fans? Yeah, I would probably say it is Reddit would be a big part of that, is that they're probably less likely to be on Reddit. Yeah. They're probably less likely to know about the controversies surrounding Lone Star. So yeah, that would be my guess. In general, the silent boomer generation, and we didn't really have any. We had very few people from the silent generation. It's mostly boomers.
Okay.
In general, they were, I guess you could call them, easier graders than the other generations. Because if you look at that table, you'll see that they're in the green. They give larger preference gaps in general to most of these manufacturers compared to other generations. So that's part of it too, is that they're just easier graders.
Got it. Less likely to give the low numbers, especially. Probably more likely to give the 5s. When you look at by source of respondents and how they found the survey, Reddit is the most polarizing of them. Lone Star almost gets a full point below, and that's something that you'd highlighted before, but also gives some higher scores as well, with a 0.37 positive to MVP. You highlight in the article that MVP's marketing director, Andrew Johnson, confirmed that they do enjoy interacting with fans on Reddit and have put resources into using that platform. It's interesting to see then that a company that has invested into their Reddit interactions, like, that pays off. Yeah.
And if I think that anybody who's active, like, I wish we had included Chris Clemens in our fandom survey, because Chris is very active in Reddit, and he's a popular player overall. It was an oversight that we didn't include him, but it would have been really interesting to see what his Reddit preference gap was. And same thing with we do have that information on Ian Anderson because he's also active in the Reddit community. So that exposure in general, equals likes.
Yeah. Over on the other thing I found interesting, you have Ultiworld and you have Foundation, and these are the two largest groups of respondents in the survey. Ultiworld fans were overall more cynical about the manufacturers, whereas Foundation are slightly positive. Now, it makes sense that they're very close to the averages because they make up the largest group of respondents. But it's interesting to me that Ultiworld listeners or Ultiworld Disc Golf fans were consistently just below the average, whereas Foundation was consistently just above it. So I guess Charlie and I are just very cynical people when it comes to manufacturers, and we've swayed people that way. It's interesting. It's more of those things that it doesn't make a ton of sense to me as to why that might be the case. Do you have any insight as to why you think that is?
I don't know. I was expecting the opposite too. I guess we're just harder graders, the people who follow disc golf as Ultiworld. I guess one thing that's important to think about when we look at the source data is that there's a very blurry line between all of this because there's lots of people who follow Ultiworld and also follow Foundation and also follow disc golf on Reddit and also, get tweets from StatMando and listen to the Nick and Matt show. So I count myself as one of those people who has multiple sources of information about disc golf. And so I could have found out about the Fandom Survey from different sources. And also some of the people who said that they came from Ultiworld Disc Golf probably found out about this through another source, but then they saw that the link was coming through Ultiworld. So they thought that, I'm filling out the survey because of Ultiworld. So this data, we have large enough sample sizes that we can infer something from it. And we are definitely seeing distinct preference gaps. But I try not to read into it too much. But, Foundation Disc Golf has this 6.0, a 0.60 preference gap for Discraft. That makes sense. They were founded by Paul Macbeth, was part of the founding group, and then Brody Smith became part of Foundation and is now a prominent member of that.
Yep.
So that 0.60 makes a lot of sense for Discraft. It's the largest single source preference gap we have.
So that takes me to what I think is the most interesting part of all the data that you've published so far, and that is the table that compares player. So it's the fandom score of, I don't know. Okay, Jesse, why don't you tell me the best way? It's the change in average fandom score for respondents who favor each manufacturer based on who their favorite player is. Is that correct?
No, this is not based on favorite player. This is based on favorite manufacturer. It is a little complicated. And when we were putting together this data, I had no idea this was going to be interesting. Like I put together the table and I was like, let's see what this is. And then I was speaking with one of the manufacturers and I was just showing them this as like, hey, and this is also something we came up with. And then they were staring at the data and saying, oh my gosh, this is something, this is something different. This would make me change my mind on $1 million decisions, like different. So it's one of those surprising gems that we got here. So let me try to explain it the best I can.
Okay.
So we take the fandom score for the players that we featured in that previous article.
Okay.
And then we cross-reference that against which manufacturer was that respondent's favorite manufacturer. Okay. So I can through examples we can better explain that. So we had 663 people who said Innova was their favorite manufacturer.
Okay.
And now we look at what's the preference gap in fandom score for those players, for those Innova fans. So if we look at the Innova fans, they gave Calvin a 0.50 bump. So from an 8.32 for our overall pool, that's what our overall pool gave Calvin. Innova fans gave him an 8.82. Now, Calvin didn't have much room to grow. He's already almost at a 10. So, but take a look at Greg Barsby. He had a 6.27 with our whole pool, and he gets a 0.63 bump for that for Innova fans.
Yeah. So what's remarkable to me, number one, is that, and this makes a lot of sense, people, like, their favorite manufacturer very strongly influences their feelings about the players, right? And if I'm gonna see, we'll put this up on the screen. Yeah, so if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and take a look at this. You can see the columns move down, and these are obviously players grouped by their manufacturer, and you can see the green, whereas everywhere else is just like the sea of red. And so Discraft, for example, has positive feelings about almost all of their MPO players. You have, and the one that's interesting, Prodigy, very, like, huge bump for those players if Prodigy is their favorite manufacturer. To a tune of an average of somewhere around like 1.5 points. Isaac Robinson 1.84, Alden Harris 1.84. I mean, significantly higher jumps if Prodigy is your favorite manufacturer, which shows a real sense of, like, that kind of brand loyalty and the like of players, kind of bringing them to Prodigy. One thing that I find, I mean, you have your trilogy players like Ricky Wysocki, for example, is popular among both Latitude 64 and Dynamic Disc fans, and that makes a lot of sense. Joel Freeman is also very popular among Dynamic Discs fans.
I'll correct you there. He's
okay.
Yeah.
He's less disliked.
Less disliked. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I thought that was interesting. What are some other highlights to you when you look at this table?
So what I was most interested in were outliers. So one outlier, for example, is that Joel Freeman is, yes, more liked by Dynamic Discs fans than by Innova fans. Now, keep in mind, Dynamic Disc fans, we only have 74 people who said Dynamic Disc is their favorite manufacturer. That's a small sample size. So we're going to be likely to get outliers on Dynamic Discs, Prodigy, where we had smaller sample sizes of people who say that's their favorite manufacturer. Corey Ellis stood out for me. This guy won the European Open. So won a major for Discraft, the only major winner for Discraft this entire year. And he gets a 0.19 bump from Discraft fans. That's barely above average. So clearly Corey Ellis is not connecting with Discraft fans. So if I were Discraft, I might find that I'd find that interesting as far as a data point. And if we go down to FPO, and we can kind of hop between these two different charts, Paige Pierce, who is the most important player on Discraft in terms of name recognition, in terms of pedigree, she's got a 0.17 preference gap, which is also very, very small. So that I also found interesting. And she's actually more popular with MVP fans than she is with Discraft fans.
Any reason why you think that is?
Well, MVP fans, we have if we go up higher in this article, we did a political breakdown of the preference gaps for these manufacturers. And MVP has a 0.23 preference gap with liberal, or we say left-wing respondents. And I think that in general, left-wing respondents like Paige Pierce more than right-wing respondents because of her sexual orientation. That would be my guess of why left-wing respondents like her more than right-wing respondents, and left-wing respondents like MVP more. And so that kind of translates there, that MVP fans would be more likely to like Paige Pierce.
I could talk about this article and especially these two charts all day. I think it's really interesting. Make sure to go read the article. Jesse, we've got a lot of unpublished data, so I want to give some of our listeners some inside access. What are some of the other data points that you want to highlight as we kind of wrap up this show that are going to be coming in future articles?
Well, we're going to have several more articles. Probably in the next month, we're going to have an article about discs. So specifically, like which Tour Series discs sell the most. That's a pretty interesting tidbit of information. How often people play disc golf, how many discs people buy, how many discs people own. We have that coming up in another article coming out soon. That's going to be written by Josiah Zuzman. And then we're also going to have an article on courses. What were your favorite courses to watch on tour? Lots of data on that. That's going to be an article coming out from Doug Tyus. And then I'm writing an article right now on commentators and on the media. What do people think of the DGN and the Jomez commentators? As that is certainly a subject for debate on all sorts of different media platforms for disc golf. And then we'll also have some just random bits of information, things that we couldn't fit into the other articles. So it should be about 8 articles in total, and we only have 3 published so far.
Awesome. Well, make sure to keep following Ultiworld Disc Golf for these articles. Jesse and I are going to be talking a little bit more about some of this unpublished data in the subscriber bonus. So if you have not gotten yourself a subscription yet, make sure to go over. You can go to Ultiworld subscribers. It's less than $4 a month. You can join us in the Discord, and you get access to some of these awesome sub bonuses. Jesse, thanks so much for coming on the program, talking about this survey and all the many hours of work that this turned into. It's a fascinating amount of research and data that I think very much gives us some real insight into the disc golf professional scene.
Oh, thanks for having me, Josh.
You've been listening to The Upshot. We will see you on Thursday.